It had been a quiet morning on the ranch, the kind of peaceful start that made him love this land more than anything else in the world. The sun had just begun to peek over the hills, spilling golden light across the fields. The air smelled fresh. Mixed with the faint scent of hay and the earthy aroma of damp soil, his cattle grazed lazily in the distance, and the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass felt like nature's own music. For years he had worked to keep this place exactly as he wanted it, untouched, natural, and his. The ranch wasn't just a property to him. It was part of his identity, something that had been in his family for generations. Every fence post, every tree, every pond had a story. He knew where the best shade was for the cows during summer, which patches of land grew the greenest grass in spring, and where the deer liked to wander at dusk. Owning this land gave him a sense of freedom. Out here, there were no noisy neighbors, no office bosses, no constant rush of city life. Just him, the land, and the animals. That's why. When he saw the first signs of something strange happening, he didn't think much of it at first. It began with a few survey markers, bright orange flags sticking out of the ground near the far edge of his property. He figured it was some kind of mistake, maybe a county worker marking something for the road. But the flags kept appearing. Then came the low hum of machinery in the distance. One day, while checking the fence line, he spotted men in neon vests, standing around with clipboards, pointing at the ground and talking in quick bursts. They didn't wave or greet him. They just kept looking down at their plans as if he wasn't even there, curious and a little unsettled. He walked up to them and asked what they were doing. One of them glanced up for a second, barely meeting his eyes, and mumbled something about a pipeline project approved by the HOA. That answer hit him like a slap in the face. HOA. His ranch wasn't even part of an HOA. His land was private. It's far away from the neat little suburban houses and manicured lawns where HOAs usually operated. When he pressed for more details, the man just shrugged and said they were authorized and had the necessary permits. Then they turned back to their work as if the conversation was over. A sense of unease inside him began to grow. Over the next few days, more heavy equipment arrived. The sounds of engines, clanging metal, and digging broke the natural quiet of the ranch. Wide trenches began to appear, cutting through the grassy fields like scars. He could see long steel pipes being lowered into the earth, each one stretching farther toward the heart of his property. At night, the blinking lights of construction vehicles glowed in the dark, a constant reminder that something was happening without his consent. He tried to get answers. He called the county office, but they told him the HOA had a right-of-way agreement. When he argued that this was his land and no such agreement existed, they told him to take it up with the HOA. He didn't even know anyone from the HOA. He didn't live in their community, didn't attend their meetings, and certainly hadn't signed any documents giving them permission. It was infuriating. His voice rose on the phone as he told them, "You can't just run a pipeline through my land without asking me." But the person on the other end only repeated that the project was already approved and too far along to stop. The more he learned, the angrier he became. The pipeline wasn't just some harmless addition. It was designed to carry water from a nearby source through his land directly to the HOA's development several miles away. This wasn't about helping him or his neighbors. It was about making sure their landscaped yards stayed green. Their swimming pools stayed full, and their fountains kept flowing, all at his expense. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun sink behind the hills, he felt a deep, heavy frustration settle in his chest. This was his sanctuary, his place of peace. And now it was being torn apart by people who didn't care about his life, his work, or his connection to the land. He thought about the time and effort he had put into maintaining this ranch, waking up before dawn to feed the animals, mending fences in the middle of winter, hauling water during dry spells. It wasn't just work, it was love. And now, without warning, strangers were carving it up for their own gain. The next morning, he drove to the HOA's office, determined to speak to someone in charge. The lobby was all polished floors, glass walls, and the faint smell of air freshener. Behind the front desk, a receptionist looked up and gave him a professional smile that felt hollow. "I need to talk to whoever's responsible for that pipeline on my property," he said. trying to keep his voice calm. She asked for his name, typed it into her computer, then frowned slightly as she read the screen. "You're not listed as a member of our HOA," she said matter-of-factly. "That's because I'm not in your HOA," he replied, his frustration creeping into his voice. "That's why I want to know why you're building on my land." She glanced over at a man in a suit who had just stepped out of an office. The man walked over, extending his hand in a fake friendly way. "I'm the HOA president," he said smoothly. "I understand you have some concerns about the pipeline." "Concerns?" he repeated, incredulous. "You're running it straight through my property without permission?" The president gave a well-practiced smile. "We have all the necessary legal clearances. This project benefits the entire community." "Your community," he shot back. "Not mine." The conversation went in circles. The president spoke in vague terms about community needs and future development plans, but never once acknowledged the wrong that had been done. Every word felt like it was designed to brush him off, to make him seem unreasonable for defending what was his. When he left that building, he felt both defeated and more determined than ever. They weren't going to stop. They didn't care about his rights or the damage they were causing. If he wanted to protect his land, he would have to fight. And as he drove back to the ranch, the sight of fresh trenches being dug and pipes being welded together only fueled his resolve. That night, lying in bed, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about how easily they had dismissed him, how casually they had taken what didn't belong to them. His mind raced with questions. How could they get away with this? Who had given them this so-called permission? And most importantly, how could he stop them? Somewhere deep inside, a decision began to form. He didn't know exactly what the next step would be, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. They might have started this fight without asking him, but he was going to be the one to finish it. The morning after his heated visit to the HOA office, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. His mind kept circling back to the same thought. They had said they had all the necessary legal clearances. That was a lie, or at least only half the truth. There had to be a trail, some paperwork somewhere, would explain how this mess had been allowed to happen. He was no lawyer, but he had lived long enough to know that when someone says it's already approved, it usually means they expect you to give up and stop asking questions. He had no intention of doing that. His first step was the county clerk's office. He drove there mid-morning, wearing his old work jeans and boots, looking like any other rancher in town. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose, seemed friendly enough. He explained that he wanted to see any permits or HOA agreements related to a pipeline running through his land. Her fingers tapped quickly on the keyboard, her eyes scanning the monitor. "Looks like the permit was issued 6 months ago," she said finally. "Filed by the HOA in coordination with a private water management company." He leaned on the counter. "And who gave them permission to build on my land?" She hesitated, clicking through more screens. "Well, according to this, the land listed isn't registered under your name. It's marked as part of an easement granted years ago to the water company that hit him like a bucket of ice water." Easement. That word carried weight. It meant there was a legal right for them to use part of his property. But he had never signed anything like that. Digging further, he found out the easement had been added decades ago, when the land was under a previous owner. No one had ever told him about it when he bought the ranch. The HOA was exploiting this old document to push their project through without talking to him. It was a loophole. They were walking right through it. Driving back to the ranch, his anger shifted into something sharper. It might have a loophole, but loopholes could be closed, and there were other ways to fight back. He just needed to understand exactly where this water was coming from and who actually controlled it. That night, he pulled out his old laptop and began researching. He found maps of the local water system, public utility documents, and geological surveys. It took hours, but slowly the picture became clear. The water that would be flowing through this pipeline didn't come from some public utility. It came from a natural spring miles away, tucked up in the hills. That spring fed into a small reservoir, owned by a private company, a company that had quietly been selling water rights to the HOA. If the source was privately owned, that meant it could be bought. And if it could be bought, then maybe he could take it away from the HOA entirely. The idea was wild, risky, and probably expensive. But it was the first time since this mess started that he felt a spark of control returning to him. Still, he couldn't rush in without knowing exactly what he was dealing with the next day. Called up an old friend, Mark, who had once worked in water rights law. They met at a small diner just off the highway over plates of eggs and bacon. He laid out everything he had learned, the old easement, the HOA's involvement, the water source in the hills. Mark listened carefully, then shook his head with a small smile. "You're thinking about buying the source, aren't you?" "I'm thinking about cutting them off at the root," he replied. Mark leaned back in his seat. "It's not impossible, but it won't be simple. You'll need to find out who owns the source right now, what their price is, and whether they're even willing to sell. And if the HOA catches wind of it, they might try to buy it first just to block you." That last point stuck with him. He was going to make a move. It would have to be fast and quiet. Over the following week, he worked like a man with 2 full-time jobs, running the ranch by day, investigating the water company by night. He found out that the owner of the spring was a small, family-run business that had been struggling financially for years. Their contract with the HOA was one of their biggest sources of income. But it wasn't enough to solve their money problems. That gave him hope. Maybe they would be willing to sell if the price was right. He drove up to see the spring for himself. The road wound through pine-covered hills, the air cooler and fresher than down in the valley. When he arrived, he found a modest chain link fence around the reservoir, with a small pump house beside it. The water shimmered in the sunlight, crystal clear, flowing down from the rocky slope above. He could see why the HOA wanted it so badly. This was a steady, clean supply, even during dry seasons. Standing there, he felt a strange mix of admiration and determination. If he could control this place, he wouldn't just stop the pipeline. He'd hold the keys to something the HOA couldn't function without. The following day, he arranged a meeting with the owners. They were cautious at first, unsure why a rancher from miles away was suddenly interested in their water source. But when he explained that he wanted to preserve and manage it himself, they began to warm to the idea. Money, of course, was the sticking point. They named a price that made his stomach twist. It was more than he had in ready cash, but he wasn't ready to give up. He asked for time to consider, then began exploring every possible option to raise the funds. He spoke to his bank, looked into selling off some unused equipment, even considered leasing part of his ranch for seasonal hunting rights. Meanwhile, the HOA's construction crews kept digging, the pipeline snaking deeper into his land. The time he saw them, it fueled his resolve. This wasn't just about protecting his property anymore. It was about proving that no one could roll over him without a fight. One night, over a beer at the local bar, a neighbor mentioned hearing that the HOA was planning a ribbon-cutting ceremony once the pipeline was finished. They were already acting like it belonged to them. The thought made his jaw clench. He realized then that this wasn't only a land dispute. It was a battle of willpower. The HOA had money, lawyers, and influence, but he had stubbornness and a personal stake they could never match. Mark called him a few days later with a warning. "I've been hearing rumors," he said. "The HOA might have found out you're looking into the water source. If that's true, they'll try to beat you to it. You need to move fast." That lit a fire under him. He spent the next 48 hours finalizing his financing, calling in favors from people he hadn't spoken to in years. By the end of it, he had scraped together enough to make a serious offer. The meeting with the Springs owners was tense. He laid the check on the table, watching their eyes widen slightly. They exchanged glances, whispering to each other. Finally, the oldest of them, a man with deep lines in his face from years in the sun, nodded slowly. "It's yours," he said. In that moment, a rush of relief and adrenaline washed over him. He had done it. He had taken the first real step toward turning the tables on the HOA. As he drove home, the evening sky blazed with shades of orange and gold. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The fight wasn't over, in fact. It was just beginning. But now he held something powerful in his hands, something the HOA couldn't ignore. And deep down, He couldn't help but smile at the thought of what would come next. Owning the water source felt like holding the ace card in a high-stakes game. It wasn't just a victory, it was a weapon. For weeks, the HOA had walked over him like he didn't matter. Now, without them knowing it yet, the balance had shifted. The spring in the hills, the one quietly feeding their precious pipeline, was no longer theirs to control. It was his, but winning the source was only the first step. A piece of paper saying you own it didn't magically end the problem. The HOA was still digging across his land, laying pipe like they had a permanent claim. If he wanted this to work, he had to play it smart. One wrong move, and they'd find a way to twist the law against him. Maybe even force him to sell it back, that night. Sitting at his kitchen table with the deed spread out in front of him, he made himself a promise. He wouldn't rush. He would move with the kind of patience that drove his cattle in the summer heat, slow and steady, but always forward. The next few days were spent in preparation. He called Mark again, telling him the news. Mark's laugh echoed through the phone. "You really did it," he said. "You just bought their lifeline. Now what's the plan?" "The plan," he said, "is to make sure they don't see it coming." Mark warned him to keep quiet, not just around the HOA, but around anyone who might talk. If word got out too soon, the HOA's lawyers would swarm like flies on fresh meat trying to find loopholes in the sale. They might even challenge it in court, claiming it was an unfair purchase, so he kept his mouth shut and went about his daily ranch work as if nothing had happened. He fed the cattle, repaired a section of fence that a storm had knocked down, checked the windmill pumps. But in between chores, he was busy laying the groundwork for what came next. He met with a water management engineer, no-nonsense woman who had spent years working on municipal water systems. She explained the technical side, how the HOA's pipeline depended on the spring's steady flow, how shutting off the pump would cause an immediate drop in pressure that would ripple down the line, and how long it would take before the taps in their homes started sputtering. Basically, she said, "You control the faucet now." The thought made him smile, but he didn't let it distract him. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about leverage. And leverage only worked if you used it at the right moment. He spent more time at the spring itself, getting familiar with the equipment and layout. The pump house was small but sturdy, the control panel simple enough for him to operate without help. Every time he turned the valve during a test, he imagined the HOA president's face when the water stopped flowing. But before he made that move, he needed one more thing: proof. He shut them off without warning. The HOA would spin the story to make him look like the villain. He needed to show that he had tried more than once to resolve the matter fairly, so he started documenting everything. He took photos of the construction damage on his land, recorded videos of the crews at work, saved every letter and email from the county and the HOA. He even made a few more visits to their office, calmly explaining that they were on his property, without permission, and asking them to stop. Each time, they brushed him off. It was exactly what he wanted. Every dismissal, every smug response, was another brick in the wall he was building against them. Meanwhile, the HOA's project neared completion. From his porch, he could see the last section of pipe being buried. Some of the workers even waved at him now, like they thought the battle was over. He didn't wave back. One afternoon, a shiny black SUV pulled into his driveway. "Don't wait." President stepped out, sunglasses hiding his eyes. A salesman's smile on his face. "Thought I'd drop by," the man said casually. "We're almost done with the pipeline. Wanted to make sure there are no hard feelings." He stood there, leaning against the porch railing, arms crossed. "You mean aside from you tearing up my land without asking?" The president chuckled like it was a joke. "It's all for the greater good. You'll see the benefits too. We're improving water distribution for the whole area." "Got my own water," he said flatly. "Always have." The president's smile faltered for just a moment before he slipped back into his smooth tone. "Well, I hope we can keep things friendly. No need to make trouble when the project's so close to being finished." He didn't bother answering. He just let the silence stretch until the president turned and walked back to his SUV. As the tires crunched down the gravel drive, he felt a spark of satisfaction. That man had no idea how much trouble was coming his way. Over the next week, He finalized his plan. Step 1. Wait until the pipeline was fully operational. Step 2. Shut off the source without warning. Step 3. Sit back and watch as the HOA scrambled. But as much as he wanted to flip the switch immediately, he forced himself to be patient. The more they invested in the pipeline, the more desperate they would be when it went dry. Mark checked, in regularly offering both advice and caution. Don't underestimate them, he said. The HOA isn't just going to roll over. They'll fight back hard once they know what you've done. I'm counting on it, he replied. Harder they fight, the more they'll realize they picked the wrong rancher to mess with. By mid-month, the HOA held their ribbon-cutting ceremony. He watched from a distance, binoculars in hand, as the president cut the bright red ribbon in front of a small crowd. They clapped, cheered, and shook hands like they'd accomplished something noble. In his mind, it was just the countdown to their collapse. That night, under a sky full of stars, he drove up to the spring. The road was quiet, the air crisp. Inside the pump house, the hum of machinery filled the space. He ran his hand along the main valve. Feeling the vibration of water rushing through the pipes, he didn't turn it off that night. Not yet. But he stood there for a long time, picturing the moment when he would. He imagined the phone calls, the confusion, the way the HOA would scramble to figure out what had gone wrong, and then the look on their faces when they realized he was the one holding the key as he locked the pump house and headed back down. The hill he knew the game was about to change. All the frustration, the disrespect, the trespassing, it was about to come crashing back on them. They had underestimated him. And soon they were going to learn that on his land, the rules were different. The first cold snap of autumn rolled over the hills the morning he decided it was time. The sky was a pale gray, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. He stood on his porch with a steaming mug in hand, looking out over the land. From where he stood, the trenches had already been filled, the pipeline buried like a snake under the soil. It was invisible now, but he could feel it there, running across his ranch without permission, carrying his water to people who didn't respect him. It had been weeks since the ribbon cutting. The HOA was bragging in newsletters about their state-of-the-art water delivery system. It's been how it would keep their lawns green year-round. He'd even heard a neighbor from town mention they were planning to expand it to more houses next. Your every word of it only made him more certain they had no idea who really owned the heart of their new system. He had waited on purpose. The more comfortable they became, the harder the blow would hit. Now their lawns were lush, their fountains splashing, their sprinklers hissing at dawn. They had become dependent on a source they didn't truly control. That morning, he loaded his truck with a toolbox, a pair of thick gloves, and a thermos of coffee. The drive to the spring was quiet. The leaves along the roadside had begun to turn gold and orange, and the world looked peaceful, a sharp contrast to the storm he was about to unleash. When he arrived, the pump house was just as he'd left it. The metal door creaked as he unlocked it, the hinges groaning in the cold air. Inside, the steady hum of the pump filled the space, a sound that had been constant for years. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the control panel. His hand hovered over the main valve. He thought about the weeks of disrespect. The president's smug smile, the way they'd talked down to him as if he was some old fool who didn't understand progress. He thought about the damage, too. His land, the way they'd acted like his voice didn't matter. His fingers closed around the valve handle. With a firm, deliberate twist, he shut it. The hum of the pump slowed, then stopped entirely. The silence that followed was thick, almost strange. The water that had been rushing down to the HOA's network was now still. He stood there in that silence for a moment, then nodded to himself. It was done. Back in his truck, he poured himself a cup of coffee from the thermos and sipped it slowly, watching the morning mist drift over the hills. Somewhere miles away, a sprinkler had just sputtered dry. Somewhere else, a kitchen faucet had slowed to a trickle. The dominoes were starting to fall. By midday, the first call came. It was the HOA president, his voice tight but trying to sound polite. "Hey there," the man began. "We're having a bit of an issue with the water supply. Our maintenance guys say it's coming from the source. Any idea what's going on?
Ty.
Kept his tone even. The source is under new ownership. There was a pause on the other end. What do you mean, new ownership? I mean, he said slowly, I bought it. It's mine now. And I didn't give permission for my water to be sent through a pipeline across my land. The president's smooth tone cracked. Can't just turn it off. That water is essential too. It's essential to people who didn't think twice about trespassing on my land, he cut in. You had your chance to work with me? You chose not to. I'm choosing not to work with you. The president started talking fast, throwing out words like contracts and agreements and public necessity, but he just let him finish, then said, If you want water, we can talk. On my terms. Until then, the tap stays off. He hung up before the man could respond. The next few days were chaos for them, not for him. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from HOA members, county officials, and even local reporters. Some of the HOA residents showed up at the ranch gate demanding answers. He didn't let them pass the fence. Mark called one evening, his voice full of barely contained laughter. They're in full panic mode, he said. I've never seen an HOA meeting this heated. Half of them want to sue you. The other half are begging to negotiate. That's exactly where I want them. He replied, the HOA's first move was intimidation. They sent a formal letter written in legal jargon, claiming he was interfering with critical infrastructure and threatening to take him to court. He read it once, then dropped it in a drawer. The threat didn't scare him. He had the deed, the rights, and a thick file of evidence showing how they had ignored him from the start. Their second move was to try and fix the problem without him. He heard through a local contractor that they'd sent crews up to Ward the spring, thinking they could somehow bypass his control. But the pump house was locked with heavy steel, and the only access to the flow was through his property. Every path to the water ran straight through him. By the end of the week, the HOA president called again, this time without the fake friendly voice. All right, the man said. What do you want? He didn't rush his answer. First, you. Repair every inch of land you tore up on my ranch, at your expense. Second, you pay a yearly fee for the right to run that pipeline, a fair one, based on market value. Third, you put it in writing that no changes can be made without my consent. That's outrageous, the president snapped. That's the deal, he replied. Or you can start trucking in water every day for your precious lawns. Your choice. There was a long silence on the line, and then the man said he'd have to take it to the board. He knew what that meant. They'd argue, they'd threaten, they'd stall. But with every day the water stayed off, their position got weaker. A week later, they came back, trying to shave down his terms. Didn't budge. He'd spent months being ignored and disrespected. He wasn't about to start compromising now. Eventually they caved. The agreement was signed, the payment transferred, and the repair crews sent out to restore his land. Watching those same workers who had once ignored him now patching up the damage felt like justice. When he finally reopened the valve at the spring, it was on his schedule, not theirs. The water rushed back through the pipes, and somewhere down the line the HOA celebrated like they'd won. But he knew better. They hadn't won, they'd learned. They had learned that you don't cross a man who knows his rights, who's willing to fight for them, who's patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And as he stood by the pump house, listening to the hum return, he felt the kind of satisfaction you don't get from quick victories. This one had been earned, drop by drop. The days after the HOA's pipeline was shut off were unlike anything the ranch owner had ever experienced. For years, they had treated him like a nuisance, stubborn man clinging to outdated property rights in a modern, connected community. Now, the roles were reversed. The HOA board, usually full of smug smiles and clipped tones, had to knock on his door like nervous schoolchildren called to the principal's office. The ranch was quiet that morning, except for the sound of wind brushing over the dry grass. But the silence in the HOA representatives' voices carried a different way too. It was the silence of desperation. They tried to begin politely, using soft words, explaining that shutting off the water was deeply disruptive to the neighborhood and urging him to work together for the greater good. He just listened. They weren't used to that. Usually they talked, he argued, and they overruled him. But now he held the cards. The water source he'd bought wasn't just a legal victory, it was the lifeblood of their comfortable lawns, swimming pools, and garden fountains. Without it, the community was on a countdown to dry taps and parched landscaping. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He let them talk themselves into a corner until one of them finally admitted that, perhaps, in hindsight, the HOA should have consulted him before laying the pipeline. That was the first crack in their wall of arrogance. He kept his expression calm, but inside he felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't revenge, it was justice, and justice had a certain flavor. Like a glass of cold water on a summer day. Over the next week, the ripple effect spread. Local news picked up the story. First, it was a small column about a dispute over water rights. But as journalists dug deeper, it turned into a narrative about a lone rancher standing up against a powerful, entitled HOA. Reporters began calling, neighbors started gossiping, and strangers sent letters of support. Some even offered legal tips or advice on how to maximize his leverage. It felt strange to be called a hero. He hadn't set out to be one. But he knew the power of public opinion was now flowing in his direction just as strongly as the water had once flowed through that pipeline. The HOA was not only embarrassed but cornered. Residents were pressuring the board to solve the problem quickly, and that meant the ranch owner could negotiate on his terms. He didn't just want an apology. Apologies were words, and words were cheap. He wanted a legally binding agreement that no one, not the HOA, not any developer, could ever touch his land without permission again. He wanted compensation for the years they had taken water without fair payment. And most importantly, he wanted acknowledgement that his rights, no matter how inconvenient to their plans, mattered. Negotiations stretched over several tense meetings. The HOA tried to appeal to his emotions, talking about families suffering. Without water, children unable to play outside, and gardens dying. But he knew their concern was less about suffering families and more about property values dropping. Every dry lawn and empty pool was a reminder to potential buyers that something was very wrong in the neighborhood. He didn't hate his neighbors, he knew most of them had nothing to do with the decision to run a pipeline through his ranch. But this was a chance to ensure they understood the cost of ignoring the person whose land they relied on. When the agreement was finally signed, it was everything he had hoped for. The HOA not only paid for the past usage, but also agreed to a fair monthly rate for any future water supply, a rate that would help him invest back into his ranch. There was also a written clause guaranteeing that if they ever wanted to make changes affecting his property, they had to seek his written approval first. Breaking that clause would trigger heavy fines. The victory wasn't just about money, it was about respect. On the day the water was turned back on, he stood near the source and watched as it flowed once again through the pipes. This time, though, it flowed because he allowed it. The community's sprinklers clicked back to life. Children squealed as pools refilled, and the once quiet streets hummed again. It was a reminder that control over resources was a kind of power many people didn't think about till they lost it. The rancher didn't hold grudges, but he also didn't forget. He knew that somewhere down the line, someone else might test his boundaries, but now there was a clear precedent. His land wasn't just a stretch of open field. It was defended ground, protected not by a fence or a sign, but by the law and his own persistence in quieter moments. Sitting on his porch with the sun setting over the hills, he thought about how close he'd been to losing. If he hadn't done the research, if he hadn't been stubborn enough to fight, the HOA would have kept taking without ever asking. It made him realize that many people in his position might have given up, thinking they couldn't win against an organized, well-funded group. But the truth was, power shifted the moment he learned exactly where their water came from. Knowledge had been the first weapon, action the second. Life on the ranch returned to its familiar rhythm. Cattle grazed in the fields, horses trotted lazily along the fence line, and the air carried the smell of grass and earth. Sometimes I'd catch sight of a neighbor passing by and giving him a small nod, different from the wary looks they used to give. It was a nod of respect, maybe even gratitude. And while he didn't need their approval, it was satisfying to know that they now understood his value, not just as a landowner, but as someone who could not be bullied or brushed aside. In the end, the fight over the pipeline became more than just a personal battle. It became a story people told about standing up for your rights, about knowing the rules well enough to turn them in your favor, about the quiet strength it takes to hold your ground when everyone tells you to move. And as the rancher leaned back in his chair, the sun dipping below the horizon, he couldn't help but smile. The water was flowing again, but this time it was flowing on his terms.